Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Today, our speaker is Dr. Tais Protasio. The topic is climate change and aging. And a few announcements before we get started. The next Grand Rounds is March 6th. The speaker is Desiree Martinez, and the topic will be the geriatric gut, the link between the microbiome, human health, and planetary health. The next journal club is the 13th of March. It'll be on Zoom, and the topics are TBD. Other announcements following today's Grand Rounds, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording for today's presentation. Please make sure to fill out the online evaluation if you don't fill it out in person here today, and submit any questions in the chat or Q&A boxes for our speaker. A little introduction: Dr. Protasio is a geriatric medicine fellow at the University of Colorado, expected to be a trained geriatrician at the end of 2024. Before fellowship, she completed I think that should be 2025. Before fellowship, she completed her internal medicine residency at the University of Colorado and medical school in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where she was born and raised. Tais is interested in working with older adults in the outpatient setting and in research in public and global health. Let's give a warm round of applause for Dr. Protasio.
Thank you, Devin. Good morning, everyone. So thank you for being here and listening to my talk. We're going to start with a quick overview for today. We're going to start with some quick facts about climate change to get us situated, and then talk about vulnerability of older adults to climate change, and see how climate change is affecting them. Then thinking about some action ideas to think about our role as providers. So starting with some quick facts, carbon dioxide or CO2 levels are at record highs in the atmosphere. They're higher than they have ever been in the last 800,000 years. And that's important, really important, because the CO2 helps trap warmth in the atmosphere, so really contributes to the greenhouse effect. In this graph here, you can see how CO2 in the atmosphere has really increased steeply since the 1960s, or kind of in the last 60 years. And that correlates with the steep increase of CO2 emission as well in these last years, or as what you can see in the gray line. With the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, we also see an increased absorption of CO2 by the ocean, and that leads to ocean acidification. And so in the last years that we have been observing an increase of 25% in ocean acidity, and that's really concerning because it can threaten ecosystems, it can change, it can affect global food security and even human survival as well. With the increase of CO2 and the greenhouse effect, we are also seeing an increase in global temperature. So this figure is from the NASA website that shows kind of every day how temperature is changing in the world. And now we're at an increase of 1.28 degrees Celsius or 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit increase when compared to the 19th century. And that kind of, as you can see again in this graph, has steeply been increasing in the last 60 years, 80 years. With increased temperature and the global warming, we're also seeing melting of the sea ice. As you can see here in this picture, kind of the mass of Greenland has really decreased steadily for the last years, as you can see in the 20 years. We believe that that has actually declined by 40% since 1979. And with ice melting, we are also seeing levels of rising in the ocean. So since 1880, we have observed a rise in 20 centimeters of the sea levels, or 8 inches, and that has actually kind of the rate of rise has increased in the most recent years. So only kind of in the last 20 years, as you can see in this graph, 30 years since 1998, we have seen an increase of 10 centimeters in the sea level. With all these changes, we're also seeing more severe and more frequent extreme weather events, such as heat waves, floods, droughts, wildfires, and hurricanes all over the world. But I brought this figure that actually shows how these things are affecting the US. So if we start kind of looking at the Northeast, we're witnessing more severe extreme precipitation events, and that's also related with more severe flooding, especially kind of in the Northeast and Midwest part of the country. In the Southeast, we're seeing more frequent and more intense North Atlantic hurricanes since the 1980s. We talked about the rising temperature and sea levels that are really kind of affecting all over the country. But the kind of thinking for us here, cold waves are becoming less frequent, which is also a big concern, at the same time as winter storms are becoming more severe and more frequent as well. In the west part of the country, we're seeing more and more severe wildfires. They're actually kind of starting earlier in the season. So they used to happen more in the spring. And now we're seeing, for example, even the LA fires that happen in the middle of the winter shows kind of some more of the severity of the wildfires. They're also kind of expanding to broader areas as well. And that's related with increased heat waves as well in the west part of the country, as well as more severe droughts. And what is driving all this climate change? Why are we seeing these changes? I brought this figure here from the fourth National Climate Assessment that in the first one shows the changes in temperature that we've been seeing since the 1880s in the black line, and comparing that to kind of changes that are expected only by natural influences. So volcanic eruptions and solar energy. And that really doesn't correlate very well, the observed changes in temperature, to that what we're seeing from the natural influences. On the second graph, we put together the changes in temperature that we're observing with the human influences, and we're seeing kind of very steep increase in the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as decrease in land cover, so kind of related to deforestation. And that kind of correlates more closely to what we're seeing with the temperature changes. Then finally, putting together all natural and human influences in the third graph, we can see that we kind of form a line similar to what we really observing. And that help us understand that really human activity is the primary driver of all these changes in climate. Human activity is responsible for around 90% of the observed global warming since the mid-20th century, and it's really more related to burning of fossil fuels. I wanted to add that deforestation also plays its role. It's also kind of part of human drivers and influences, but also affects climate change by increasing carbon emissions and also decreasing carbon sequestration and altering the water and energy cycles in the planet. So I brought this figure for us to try to understand how these changes in temperature are kind of expected to affect our lives and our planet. And that was plotted by WWF. And when they look into estimated changes, if we have a 1.5 degrees Celsius change versus a 2 degrees Celsius change, and we can see at the 2 degrees Celsius model and estimations, we're going to see more species being affected, from insects to plants and also vertebrates. We expect to have 410 million people being exposed to severe droughts by the year of 2100. We virtually should not be seeing any more coral reefs at all by the year of 2100 as well. And that also affects the cost. We expect to see lower economic growth, especially in lower income countries with this higher temperature rises. And for every half degree of warming, we expect to see lower yield and lower nutritional value of our food as well. And thinking about these expected changes with 2 degrees Celsius, that's why some global agreements have been happening, and we can focus on the Paris Agreement that more than 190 countries signed back in 2015, sorry, and really kind of trying to limit carbon emissions and limit climate change and global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Climate change is also affecting our economy and has a huge economic burden. There was this report by the International Chamber of Commerce that has evaluated that the global cost of climate-related extreme weather events has been around $2 trillion over the last decade. And that has really increased more significantly in the last 2 years, with a global cost of around $450 billion only in the last 2 years, representing a 19% increase of costs when compared to the previous 8 years of the decade. And these costs include costs of damage of infrastructure, property, agriculture, and human health as well. And when we look into the US has lost actually $100 billion every year related to heat-induced decline in labor productivity. And why we're talking about this today, well, the climate crisis is also a healthcare crisis. Climate change is believed to be the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And it affects not only longevity, but also quality of life, limiting people's ability to be and do what they value. And it affects some populations than others. So we're going to focus on our older adults. They're really disproportionately affected. And to understand more how older adults are more affected, we have to understand that our population is really diverse and there are specific vulnerabilities that really makes them more susceptible to climate changes. Um, so I brought this table from an article published now, early 2025, in JAMA, that really kind of help us understand vulnerability of older adults and how they affect their health in terms of and how they are related to affecting their health in terms of climate change. So first we can think about physiologic changes. With age, people tend to have lower skin blood flow, and that reduce their ability of sweat and reduced capacity to adapt to heat. They also tend to have reduced fluid regulation and ability to sense dehydration, so decreased thirst, not only related to medications, but from physiological changes alone. We know our older adults also tend to have more chronic diseases, and these chronic diseases are at higher risk of exacerbation during these times of extreme weather. They tend to have some functional decline and mobility issues that can definitely impair their ability to respond to emergency situations and climate disasters. Which is kind of similar to cognitive impairment that not only affects their ability to respond to the emergencies, but also affects their ability to recognize risks and take preventive measures related to climate change. We also know that our older adults are, tend to be in more medications, and there are a lot of medications that can affect thermal regulation, and with that affect their fluid balance and how they can respond to heat diseases. So some that we should think about are diuretics and laxatives, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and antihypertensive medications as well. Finally, we've been also worried about loneliness and social isolation in our older adults that also kind of limit their ability to respond to emergencies and, with with decreased connections and support in the community. But they also increase their risk of developing more mental health diseases related to climate change. I wanted to add that some older adults may have more compromised immune systems, and that makes them more susceptible to developing diseases that are more common, especially vector and waterborne diseases. And then hearing impairment is another barrier for them to communicate during emergencies. And not only these physiological changes and changes to their health can affect their ability to respond to climate change, but also the social factors play a big role. And there are different articles that comment on that, but I only brought this figure from this review from 2017 that kind of give us an idea that race and their access to resources, poverty, where they live, all of that can also influence their vulnerability to develop changes from climate disasters, or develop, for example, food insecurity, or a need to be displaced or migrate, and changes in their health as well. And this article also mentions how these changes, also the changes in climate changes can affect and exacerbate these vulnerabilities and inequities as well. So let's think about how climate change can impact our older adults. We're gonna start thinking about extreme heat, because this is really where we have more data published so far. And I brought this image from the Lancet Countdown report from 2024 that shows how heat-related mortality of adults of 65 years old and older has really increased more than we would expect if there was no heat changes, no temperature changes in the world. So it has increased by 167% versus 65% that would be expected if there are no increases in temperature, in global temperature. When we look into events that happened in the past, during the Pacific Northwest heat wave that happened in 2021, people over the age of 65 accounted for 3/4 of all the deaths in the Washington state that year. We know that extreme heat is also associated with increased risk of dehydration and AKIs, renal failure, and UTIs. And high temperature can also increase blood flow and heart rate, increasing hypertension, risk for cardiovascular mortality, ischemic heart disease, and heart failure during these events. Extreme events have also increased, extreme heat events have also increased the risk of admission in the hospital for cardiovascular and respiratory disorders. And there was this national study that estimated how severe that has been affected, and it has estimated that every year the US is seeing around 235 million emergency department visits, or 56,000, sorry, thousands, 235,000 ED visits, and 56,000 hospital admissions related to heat waves each summer, with an around of $1 billion in healthcare costs. There's also a new article also published in JAMA this year that showed that temperature variability and extreme heat have been linked with dementia-related hospital admissions, and that has affected more Asian, Black, and Hispanic groups. When we look into wildfires and the deadliest US wildfire that happened back in 2023 in Hawaii, more than 2/3 of the victims that died were also above 60 years and above. And there are different studies that show the association between short-term exposure to wildfire particulate matter in the air to increase hospital admission, all-cause mortality, and these admissions are usually related to respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Older adults are also more likely to use emergency care services and be hospitalized due to these diseases more than younger people. And wildfires also affect, destroy houses and affect lifestyles and tend to prevent aging in place. In terms of air pollution, with all these climate changes, warmer days, and precipitation changes and wind pattern changes, that leads to entrapment of air pollutants and fine particulate matter in the atmosphere. And this fine particulate matter have been associated with asthma incidents and exacerbation, as well as COPD, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, and pneumonia. And that is specifically more concerning for our population that has a decreased clearance of these fine particulate matter with age, as age progresses. Older people have a higher risk of death per particulate matter increase when compared to younger populations. And there are different studies showing that the long-term exposure to these to air pollution and specific fine particulate matter have been linked with increased rate of cognitive decline as well. Floods have also become more severe and especially related to changes in extreme precipitation, and they have been related to fatal and non-fatal acute coronary syndrome events, such as MI and Takotsubo syndrome, as well as stroke, that our population is more susceptible to. In terms of infections, the changes in climate are making the environment more suitable for transmission of some diseases. And we've been seeing some changes in vector-borne diseases. For example, the West Nile virus that causes encephalitis, commonly in older adults. It was only introduced in the US in 1999 and is now the leading cause of mosquito-borne disease in the US. There's also a growing incidence of dengue all over the world, but we can see that even in the US, we have history of more recent outbreaks of locally acquired dengue that happen in Texas and Florida. So these are changes from the past. And we also have a higher risk of waterborne pathogens to be present in drinking water and affecting our older adults. They're specifically more susceptible and may have more severe health outcomes, including death. And as an example, we can talk about vibriosis from the Vibrio cholerae, for example, that really reached record highs numbers globally in 2023. In terms of disasters, we have learned from past hurricanes. For example, the Hurricane Katrina that happened in the US in 2005. 71% of the fatalities related to the hurricane were older people, despite them only being 15% of the population. After hurricanes, studies have noticed the barriers to access medications as well as disruption of dialysis due to power outages, which is so concerning for our patients that may depend on them. They also noticed an increase in hospital admissions due to chronic diseases exacerbations such as diabetes, COPD, and heart failure. And there's also a concern with the need for evacuation, especially for persons who live in nursing homes or assisted living facilities that can have a higher risk. Finally, I wanted to touch base on mental health effects from climate change. This is a figure from a literature review published in 2023. And also kind of as the other effects that we talked about, vulnerability kind of changes how people will develop effects from climate change. But here they mentioned that the prevalence of some mental health diseases have increased, such as PTSD and depression, cognitive disorders such as dementia, psychotic disorders, anxiety, and substance use disorder as well. They have noticed an increased risk of suicide ideation, aggressiveness, and hospital admissions related to mental health disease. And there have been more diagnoses of climate anxiety as well as solostasia, which was a new term that I learned, but it's really there to describe the distress people feel related to climate changes, especially when they feel powerless to deal with these changes. And I don't know about you all, but I start feeling some climate anxiety and solostasia thinking about these subjects. So I didn't want us to feel powerless and wanted to talk about some actions and some ideas for us to deal with to think about our role as healthcare providers and to deal with climate change. First, so important to stay informed and understand what is happening around us and how that's affecting our population. So important to understand our footprint as individuals, but also as healthcare providers in a healthcare system. To understand our patients' vulnerabilities to climate change, to then be able to consider climate change in our medical decisions. With all that, we should be able to educate and counsel our patients, especially around mitigation and resilience to climate change. And finally, wanted to talk a little bit about advocacy and how we can introduce that to our patients as well. So how can we stay informed? I just brought some resources that I wanted to share. The first one is the Lancet's Countdown report that they have been publishing every year since 2015, since the Paris Agreement. And it's there really to kind of help us track the changes and the links between climate change and healthcare changes and how that's affecting healthcare. There's this other website from Colombia, the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education, that was launched in 2017, and it really aims to educate healthcare providers on the impacts of climate change and prepare them for action and to be able to respond appropriately. They offer different courses, and they're all free and open to the public. And then there's this Aging and Climate Clearinghouse that is more focused on changes of climate change related to our older adults. And it has information for older adults in terms of advocacy, but also kind of how and why to get involved and what to expect in climate change. Has some information for organizations, more organizations that have been involved in climate change advocacy, and kind of how to maybe get more volunteers, especially older adults, for their cause, and information for researchers and clinicians. They have an updated publication database that kind of I learned a lot from, and also have some information on grants and funding that can also be important for researchers. So I wanted us to understand our footprint and how us as healthcare providers in a healthcare system are affecting our climate as well. The healthcare system has actually a huge impact on climate change. The healthcare sector in the US produces 8 to 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the US, so pretty significant. And when we think about the US healthcare system compared to the world, it is responsible for about a quarter of all global healthcare greenhouse gas emissions in the world. That's actually more than any other healthcare system in any other country. Um, Hospitals, for us to think about, are the second most energy intensive commercial buildings in the country, only after food services facilities. In terms of waste, the healthcare industry produces 5.9 million tons of waste every year, including disposable plastic devices and pharmaceuticals that really have an environmental impact. There's a study published in the Science of the Total Environment that found that around 80% of all US rivers have been contaminated by pharmaceuticals, which also has huge environmental impacts and can affect aquatic ecosystems. So I want us to think about this huge carbon footprint in our healthcare system, and also recognize that we have a good opportunity as healthcare providers to promote some mitigation of climate change through from inside the healthcare system. And what is our impact as geriatric care providers, as taking care of very complex older adults? There was this study published in the UK that evaluated frailty and its carbon footprint, and it saw that frailty as a whole was responsible for 6% of all carbon emission in the UK healthcare system. So pretty significant. And we're also, frequently prescribing hearing aids and disposable continence products and walking devices, and they they can also contribute to waste and have their own environmental impact. When we think about all the medications that we prescribed, the production of these medications also have a huge carbon footprint as well. So I wanted to bring these facts just for us to think about how our medical decisions also impact our environment, and how we should be thinking about these impacts in terms of making our medical decisions as well. So how can we counsel our patients around this matter? First, let's think about resilience, or how to adapt to this climate change. I do think, first of all, we should be able to integrate climate change into our health risk assessments. So understand our patients' vulnerabilities, going back to that table that we talked in the beginning, and understanding how more they can be affected by climate change. For example, for the patients who have cardiovascular disease and pulmonary disease, we should be more mindful about how air pollution and air quality can affect their diseases. Or thinking about the medications they're on, and maybe if we're going through moments of extreme heat, that we should be thinking about reduce their diuretics, or one more reason to avoid anticholinergics, for example. I brought this pamphlet from the CDC that is trying to educate patients on how to respond to heat, and to stimulate them to talk to their doctors about it as well. So first of all, in the middle of the picture, we should be talking to them about staying hydrated, staying cool as well. So trying to stay inside in a cool environment if they have a fan, or ideally air conditioning. If they don't have air conditioning, every city should have cooling centers that they can go to. In Denver and Aurora, the most common ones are libraries, but we can also think about shopping malls where they can spend the day, for example. We should educate them on knowing the symptoms of heat strokes and heat cramps, to know when to look for help and make sure they are hydrated in cool places. So unusually heavy sweating, feeling dizzy, nauseous, weak, or headaches or tired. They also stimulate patients to check the air quality. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, and have a medication plan. So making sure they have a cool place to store their medications, making sure they have plans to store the medications in case of power outages, and as I talked about, also discussing medication changes with a physician. In terms of air pollution resilience, that we should be more mindful, as I said, for example, in those patients who have more cardiovascular or respiratory diseases, and should be protecting themselves more mindfully against the air pollution. We should be checking for air quality. So I believe iPhone on the weather app has some information on air quality, but the Environmental Protection Agency also offers this Air Now app that you can download with this QR code, and share with patients as well, that give us information on air quality kind of all over the US. Patients that are more vulnerable to air pollution changes should also minimize outdoor exposure. If the air quality is not adequate, and if they are going to go outside, they should be wearing N95 masks. Inside, be mindful of having air filters and air purifiers that we change frequently to reduce the exposure to these dangerous particulate matter as well. And finally, I brought this website from the Environmental Protection Agency because they have a lot of information for patients in terms on how to prepare and respond to natural disasters. And they have information in English, but also in Spanish and other languages. So it's a good one to share with patients as well. So thinking about mitigation, so how to reduce the causes of climate change. First, I wanted us to think about individual changes. So considering our individual carbon footprint and how to reduce them. Consider different transportation options. So using public transportation or walking or biking, that can all reduce our carbon footprint, as well as trying to conserve energy as much as we can, and using appliances that are energy efficient as well. Considering switching our vehicles for electric vehicles, that can also reduce our carbon footprint. Be mindful of our consumption to reduce waste in food and water, but also be mindful of the things that we're buying and how sustainable they are. Having more advantage to use biodegradable things. That's also a good way to have a lower environmental impact. Thinking about recycling more and using less plastic as well. These are things that we can take for our lives, but also talk to our patients about. And maybe discussing how the benefits of mitigation of climate change, also in terms of having some health benefits to our patients. So if they're using biking more and walking more, they're being more active. So we have double benefits there. Or if they're eating more plant-based diet, that can improve their cardiovascular health as well as reduce their carbon footprint. Or if they're using energy efficiency, efficient appliances, that can reduce their bills as well as reduce air pollution. In terms of mitigation for us as providers, I brought this figure from this Green Physician Toolkit that is published by the Royal College of Physicians. They have over there kind of more information on how to help physicians to mitigate climate change. And what I think is interesting is that a lot of these concepts are actually things that we already put in practice as geriatricians. So, for example, trying to reduce unnecessary prescribing, reduce blood tests and unnecessary procedures, consider prescribing medication, advocating for suitable practices, trying to generate less waste. They here in the UK, they also advocate for limiting environmental impact of travel. So really try to use more telehealth as a way of having a lower environmental impact. Another things for us to think about is practicing good preventive medicine. So trying to prevent frailty, hospitalizations, and ED visits that have a higher carbon footprint when comparing to outpatient care, and making sure we have a safe plan for disposing our medications. So talking to our patients about the take back programs that they can bring medications to the clinic, or most pharmacies will take them to do the safe disposal of them as well. In terms of reducing waste, I just wanted to share some ideas that we can share with patients in terms of donating medical devices and increasing recycling as well. So there's this Hearing the Call from Colorado that will take used hearing aids and they upcycle them and donate to other people who need it. It's similar to the Lions Club of Denver, which is this third one on the right, that will take both hearing aids but also used glasses, and they can upcycle them and donate them as well. The Project Cure will take used medical devices such as beds, hospital beds, and crutches and walkers, and they donated for other countries around the world. And finally, the Blue Star Recyclers is a company that recycles electronic devices. I feel like these ones sometimes are harder for us to recycle, and they also create jobs for people with disabilities, so it's pretty cool. The QR code give us a list of loaning facilities for medical devices. So another possibility, instead of buying every time new devices, especially if people are not going to use it for a long period of time, UC Health already put up a list together for Colorado. And finally, I want us to think about advocacy in terms of stimulating our older adults to participate in advocacy, to use their strength to be involved, but also seeing that as a way to create a sense of agency for them, contribute to their sense of purpose, having stimulating an active mind and social connection. And I brought some examples of that. I really like this picture that is an act done in New York by the Third Act, is a community of older adults, 60 and older. And here they are on this walk to advocate for more environmental friendly policies at Citibank HQ. And I like this picture because you can see different patients bringing their chairs and using their canes. And I feel like it's easy to think about their vulnerabilities, but I also want to stimulate us to think about advocacy as something that we can talk to them about and have dual benefits in having them involved. So some ideas on where to start and how to talk to them about it. One is the Elders Climate Action, is a organization that started in 2014, and that involves older adults in different kind of petitions for the Congress to improve policies, as well as improve, have groups of discussions, and with really the goal to improve environmental justice and and work with these causes. Third Act is the one that we saw on the other picture, is also a community of older adults, and they have working groups all over the US and one here in Colorado. So it's one that we can share. And the 350.org company, it's one that is more focused on increasing renewable energy to communities. Finally, I want us to think about what to expect in kind of future directions. Here in this graph by the IPCC, on the orange part, we can see how temperature has been increasing as we've been seeing in the last years, and kind of how if it continues that way, we're probably going to reach increase the temperature more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. But then it shows also different modules and projections that can happen in this kind of shaded lines. The purple shaded line shows what can happen to temperature if we don't have any reduction in our CO2 emissions. So really temperature can continue to rise and has a higher risk of reaching the 2 degrees Celsius, which is kind of has all those effects that we talked about. Versus if we're able to reduce our carbon footprint, our carbon emissions in the blue shaded line part, we can see that we're able to reduce temperature to actually even closer to 1 degree increase or less than 1.5. So I want us to look at this and think about that as how remembering our footprint and our role in all this, and that hopefully we can still decrease our carbon footprint, and with that be able to kind of reverse some of the changes in climate change. These are my references. Wanted to have some time for questions, and maybe you guys can share about your experience with climate change in older adults. I would love to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Protasio. That was wonderful. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Very nice talk. I don't think that this should be a bipartisan issue, but I believe that it is, or maybe we can say that there are believers in climate change and they believe the science, and there are those people that deny climate change. Do you have any suggestions on how to talk to individuals who might deny climate change? Maybe not from a preaching to them perspective, but how to perhaps allow them to understand the science a bit better?
That's a good question. So I learned a lot to do this talk, and there's so much information out there, and there's so much information that actually has been plotted into figures and graphs. So, and I think that these things really help even people who are not in the medical field to really see how things are changing. So maybe sharing a little bit of that and kind of all the information that is there. The other thing is, maybe even if you don't believe in climate change, you can see how the extreme weather events are really affecting people. So for these people that don't believe in it, it's still kind of a good idea to engage in things that can help them be more resilient or even mitigate climate change in that sense. So I think this is something I have to think more about in terms of convincing. But again, there is so much information out there and kind of palatable information, easy to assess. Maybe that's where we can start.
Thank you, Tais. Lots of scary information, a little depressing, but thank you for bringing some hope at the end of the talk. I just wanted to share one experience and then ask a question. So I was scuba diving a couple weeks ago, and my sport is being ruined by climate change. But interestingly, the dead coral happened to be much more these very large, older corals, 300-year-old brain corals. And then you would move alongside and you'd see smaller corals that were still relatively healthy. So I think it shows the vulnerability of other organisms that are non-human in our environment, that vulnerability to these changes that we're seeing in climate. The other question I had, I actually pulled up the EPA website while you were talking, and the new director has Trump's initiatives that we all deserve clean air and water, but then everything else, all the other initiatives really go against that. And one of them was to be a leader in AI. United States is going to be the leader in AI. And I think about the energy that's generated with AI, and now we're using it more and more here in medicine. And if you have any comments on that aspect of the medical community contributing to climate change in any ways that we may have to mitigate that.
Right. I honestly have to read more about the impacts of AI and climate change and energy use. One thing that I can say is that regardless of how you're using the energy, if you have better renewable sources of energy, so, wind energy, that could be, or sun power, for example, overall, we can continue to use the energy in a more clean way.
Great talk. I'm a physiologist, so my question is going to focus on the physiology aspect of climate change. And I'm fortunate enough to be working with some colleagues at Penn State who study this and what makes older adults more susceptible to heat intolerance. And there's a sex difference there. I believe maybe women are more susceptible to this. We're looking at the specific changes in hormones and how that's contributing to this. But I'm wondering, in any of your readings that you've come across, are older women more susceptible to like the development of chronic conditions related to these heat stresses, and what particular reasons have you come across that are contributing to this?
Got it. There is such a large world of information that is more related to social changes and, genre, and ethnicity and all that, that can affect their vulnerability to climate change. I actually didn't dive too much on that, so I wouldn't know. But that's a good question, something to think about. I'm sorry.
I just want to circle back to Josh's question. One thing that came to mind was, when approaching climate change with folks who are not necessarily in the camp of acknowledging the changes and how that may impact their health, utilizing lower inference feedback and talking to them about specific objective findings versus probably going meta and having larger conversations about the overall elements of climate change that we all know and appreciate, but maybe focusing on specific disasters, specific elements like heat waves, floods, et cetera, that might be affecting folks. Just one thing that came to mind.
You mentioned that hospitals are like a big contributor to CO2 footprint. Any recommendations on like what we can do as physicians who work for a large hospital on how to advocate for the hospital to like limit their impact?
Good question. So things that I saw that are more related to it is one, kind of the transportation part of it. So, even how things are transported to the hospital, the food services in the hospital, and energy expenditure is a big one. So I keep thinking of kind of individual changes, what you can do. And if you look around the hospital, people never really turn off the lights, and kind of me included, and I've been thinking more about it. If we're not talking about one light, but we're talking about a whole sector of maybe 100 lights per, floor. So this is something that can make a difference in the small scale, but potentially, if we're talking about all hospitals around the country, that can have a bigger impact. In terms of food services, so hard to to, be involved with. And then thinking about, as I said, really limiting things that may not be needed. So if we're not getting as many of the procedures that we're recommending, or having less of the blood work, all even thinking about how people are transporting themselves to these things, all of that has its own impact. So that can also make a difference.
Hey, thank you for the important and very thorough talk. One thing I was going to just make a plug for was the Global Health Consortium through Columbia. I actually had the opportunity to be involved with helping construct some of the materials for their website. I think it's really a great resource, and one thing that I did at my medical school was actually help implement that into problem-based learning for medical students. So for any of our faculty in the room that are involved in the School of Medicine, teaching small group sessions, that's actually a really good opportunity to educate like medical students about a lot of these topics. So just wanted to plug it.
Cool,
So
thank
for
you.
highlighting it.
Congrats.
No, it's okay.
So Tais, thank you so much. I appreciate you focusing on something we don't typically hear about. We had a really good Grand Rounds, by the way, a few weeks ago. If folks didn't hear about it, it was the kidney and climate change. And a lot of it had to do with dialysis and not being able to get there. So one of the things that I think we can do, I'd love to hear your thoughts, is carbon offsets and whether you think that's a useful thing. I pay for them every month. I don't know if it's useful. I have a friend who's a climate economist, and he says it is. So I do it because he says it is. So I would love your thoughts on that. And then also, when I was calculating my carbon offset, my air travel was a real problem. And so I've tried to cut back on that. And I know, as you know, we were saying, what can we do as academics? We could probably travel less. And
Sure.
try to have a few targeted conferences we go to.
Sure.
But anyway, just love your thoughts on the air
No, I
travel
agree.
situation.
I think it's super interesting to kind of understand more how you individually is kind of affecting climate change, and kind of that's how we can help you. In terms of even, I think being able to see your impact in individual levels, you can think of even kind of eating meat, for example, that can make a big difference. If you're not going to change your diet completely, maybe reduce, and that can potentially reduce partially of your impact as well, versus driving the car and how if your car is electric or not. So I think it's informative for people, and kind of help us making decisions definitely as well.
And Tais, Dr. Lum online is asking, any stories or examples related to addressing climate-related anxiety or other mental health aspects, which I think we are all familiar with personally?
I would not know how to, don't know how to answer that question. I think first, having a good community support is one thing that I think about, because it's not one thing that we're going through individually, but as a community. For me, it's helpful to think about actionable ideas to reduce that sense of powerless as well. And otherwise, really thinking about, the way that we treat mental health diseases overall.
Carrie, I'm so curious about your carbon offsets. Can you just speak a little bit more about that? That may be something we could advocate for our patients.
Sure. So basically, you can go on. I go through TerraPass because this climate economist told me to do that, and so you go on there and you say how many miles you travel, your air travel, and do you eat meat, and do you have an electric car, and it has you calculate what your burden is on the world, and then it gives you an amount that you can purchase in trees or other things that help the earth recover your burden on the earth, and so. There's evidence, I mean, I don't know if there's evidence, but there are certain groups that tend to do it better than others. So I encourage you to do some research on which ones are legit. Apparently TerraPass is legit. And then they go plant some trees, or they do other things to help offset what you've done to our earth. So anyway, I pay, and it's not that much. I think I pay, what do I do? I think $30 a month or something, and it just gets charged auto pay, and apparently that offsets my problem, me being a problem.
And hopefully our patients can bill that to Medicare.
Hi, this is Samantha. I just will comment on the existential climate anxiety. The field of psychology does have various ways to address kind of existential crises like climate change and therapies. I also agree with what you're saying, Tai. First of all, great presentation, really kind of dystopian in this current moment, but I think really needed and very important for us to consider. But some of the strategies for trying to help with that sense of helplessness is to try to translate when someone has a very deep value or a very deep connection to something like climate change or the crisis of climate change, how to translate that into individual action in the real world, not just looking online and doing online advocacy, but how can they become more active in their local communities. You know, I think, Carrie, you've given a great example of how you can donate or try to offset things. So there are ways that psychologists and mental health providers try to help mitigate this. And there's a whole entire field on existential therapy, and I think this kind of falls in that category. Oh, and one other thing is helping folks connect with not just local individual actions, but how to have more collective action so that there can be actual policy change that results in improving some of this.
Just to echo everybody's point, thank you for a great talk. I'm coming from a physiologist perspective again here, and curious if, in your opinion, if there's ever a world that can exist where a geriatrician's working collaboratively with a physiologist to help older adults heat acclimate so that they can better tolerate this issue. So I'm thinking about it more as accepting that this is happening. Now, how do we help older adults better engage in this current reality?
Definitely seems like a great idea. I didn't think about all these physiological changes and how that affects vulnerability for older adults before. So I think having a more input from our standpoint, from physiologists, that can definitely be helpful to first try and kind of understand how much older people can be affected. And as you said, even in kind of studies and trying to understand how we can adapt better to it. One thing that I learned, and kind of it's not necessarily what you asked, but for example, if temperatures are above 35 degrees Celsius and you only use a fan, that's not really as helpful really as you kind of use some humidification for your body and with a fan. So these are things that I feel like we don't learn as doctors, and kind of understanding better the physiology and when kind of physics of things, we can also kind of have better information to share with the patients, definitely.
I'm so curious about different medications and their impact on body temperature too, and I'd be just curious to talk to pharmacy about that and how that impacts physiology and heat acclimation. I have to make a quick plug because there was an amazing article in the New York Times about recycling and basically how the United States and the developed world ships all of these recyclables and single plastics overseas. And I just kept thinking about our healthcare system and the fact that we have so much single-use plastic, and it traffics this huge carbon footprint abroad. As providers, as faculty, as folks, if we advocate for biodegradable materials that house our medical equipment, et cetera, I feel like that would be so important.
And reducing single-use kind of equipment as well. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, thanks for your talk, first of all. I really feel like kind of plugged into the climate space, so I really appreciated this kind of talk. And something I wanted to ask about was like climate migration in the future. There are a lot of places on the planet that are not going to be maybe quite so livable in the next 50 to 100 years or so, which will probably disproportionately affect older adults who might need to try and move. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on climate migration in the future on older adult populations and what we could do about that, or to maybe aid that.
Right. Listened to a podcast about it, and it seems like we can understand more things that have happened, but I don't remember that they were able to really have kind of a good projection of what things are going to happen, kind of how we can prevent from people to be affected, or even kind of improve migration from, kind of preventively, in kind of in a more mindful way, I guess. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that, but that's a good point.
Tais, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Big round of applause.
Thank you.